Hello, and welcome to another episode of Books and the World. I'm Ray Cormier, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to another episode of this series that is brought to you by the Cape Cod Writers Center. My guest today is Heather Abel, who is the author of a really impressive first novel called The Optimistic Decade. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Congratulations on the book. I really think of it as a real piece of literary fiction. One that can be read in many, many ways. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, you said it in the West. Uh-huh. You're a California girl.
I am.
But now you're in Northampton, Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. So how'd you get to New England?
Well, it went in stages. I was living after college. I went back to California as soon as possible. And then my grandfather, who was still in New York, said to me, you have to go to grad school in New York. So I did. And I met a guy. And I met him at a party, and he said,
"Well, that happens." Huh?
Yeah, it happens. It was great. But he said to me, "So what's your plan after grad school?" We were both in grad school, and I said, "I'm going to move to Colorado as quickly as possible." And then we started dating, and he was finishing up his doctorate, and he got a job in UMass Amherst. So I didn't move back to Colorado, so I had to write a novel that took place in Colorado, so I could spend some time there, at least in my own head.
Ah, okay. Mm-hmm. Well, again, congratulations on the book. I'm going to try to summarize this.
Okay, good luck.
It's not easy to summarize, but let me try. At its simplest, it's a coming-of-age story set in a wilderness camp in the high desert of Colorado back around 1990. Right? The camp has a strange name, Lama Lo, which the book points out is from the Hebrew for why not.
Yes.
And its young founder tries to get campers and counselors alike to free themselves from the pull of society, as it were, to find their true selves. Mm-hmm. Okay, but it's a story filled with paradoxes, and in the end, am I right? It's a study of idealism and disillusionment.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, fair?
Mm-hmm. Yes,
okay.
That was a great summary. I wish you had given that to me years ago when I had to give it to my publisher. Yeah.
Could you explain, though, the genesis of the story? I raise it because you did write an essay in which you sort of link it to your grandmother.
Yeah, I mean, the story, sometimes I think of it as like one of those bushes that has roots all over, because there was many different geneses. But my grandmother was definitely one of them. She was this very impressive woman. She was a mystery writer. She was incredibly radical and dogmatic and full of purpose. And as I got to know her, I realized she was actually quite disillusioned. And yet she sort of every day went out, and she lived on the Upper West Side when I knew her, and she every day went out and did tabling for this cause or that cause. And I ended up writing it at a time where I started it when I was younger, and I thought, well, what does it mean to sort of have inherited this sense that you should act in the world and you should protest and you should do these things, but that they're not going to work, which was sort of what I felt like was my inheritance from not just my maternal grandmother, but my parents as well.
Right.
That was one of the things that started me writing the book.
And that essay, you say that you found, was it at her death? You found a yearbook, or a reunion book.
A reunion book
in
from
which
Barnard.
She was lamenting having sort of failed at what she wanted to do in life.
Not just herself, but she sort of included the entire class of Barnard class of something very 36, saying we have done something wrong. Like, we did not heal the world in the way that was ours to heal. We did something wrong. Right. And this sense that no matter how you act, you're not going to do enough. Right. And so I have, as one of the main characters, this young girl, Rebecca, whose parents are journalists, but radical journalists, really trying to change the world through their newspaper, and also this sense that it's not going to work.
Right. Yeah, Rebecca, she's in the book, she's a freshman at Berkeley, and she wants more than anything to emulate her father and follow in his footsteps as this radical journalist. Yeah. Right? And in the book, she ends up going to this camp run by her cousin Caleb, who is also an idealist, but in a non-political way. Yeah. Correct? And it's a theme that seems very relevant today. What do you think the place of idealism is in today's world? after you've spent all these years thinking about
Yeah, I mean, I think that idealism is kind of the rope we hold on to get through the day sometimes. And I think that one thing I sort of came to through writing this book is that idealism is not a pure state that I sort of think Rebecca wanted it to be, and I wanted it to be when I was younger, where you're idealistic and you're marching in the world changes and you see it change, but instead it's sort of a practice, something you do every day. It almost, in the book I sort of liken it to a religious practice in a way, that it's something you do without always knowing what the result's going to be. You don't know that this, that starting this camp is going to create these different people the way Caleb thinks, or that writing the newspaper is going to change policy the way Ira, Rebecca's father, thinks. But that in doing those, you will make changes that you're not quite sure of what they're going to be. More a sense of uncertainty.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of this till just now, but it's almost, in a way, you end up arguing that it's almost like being a monk. You're off in your own little world praying and hoping things will change, but you're never going to see it in a way, I guess.
Right. Yeah, although I think that what Rebecca comes to, at least in the end, is that it doesn't need to be something you do in isolation, sort of the way Caleb believes or the way her father acts, but it's something you do in community. And that, I think, is what, that's what changes it for her in the end. Yeah.
Okay. But despite the high ideals involved in this, you set your book amid some very real events in the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
In particular, you use the oil shale boom and bust in Colorado as an underpinning of the story. Why then and there?
Sure. So after college, I moved to this tiny town in Colorado, and I got there, and I had these images of Colorado from like, I'd never gone to Aspen or these ski areas, but I'd seen pictures, and it seemed very dramatic. And the town I moved to is so beautiful, but it's a beauty that you don't see right away. It's high desert, and it's sort of scrubby, and there's nowhere to downhill ski. And I got there, and I was very smitten by it. And I started working for a newspaper called High Country News, which is a really small, not so small anymore, but environmental newspaper that covers the West. And I read about the oil shale boom and bust in that area, and how Exxon came in and said, well, we're going to take the oil shale, which is all under the ground in western Colorado, and we're going to turn it into oil, which is, of course, what we need everywhere. And people were thrilled, and they flooded in, and there was 10,000, 20,000 people moved in over a course of a couple of years, and, it was a boom town. So stores were being built, and people were camping out, and just the entire place changed. And then Exxon woke up one day and realized, oh, what you need to make oil shale into oil is water. And, of course, what western Colorado does not have is water. So they shut it down overnight, and 10,000, 20,000 people were unemployed. And I was so struck by that because I was interested in living there, in how much I sort of felt like I wanted to claim this very unfamiliar place, and I wanted to belong there. And I was interested in the history of people moving there and saying, oh, we're going to change it this way, and we're going to change it that way, and how that can change both the culture and the economy of a place. So I wanted a character that wanted to come and do that, but I wanted him to come and face a real culture clash. So that's Caleb. Caleb went out there to start his idealistic wilderness camp, and he gets there right after the bust. So he's seen people in real despair, and he's seen people have lost their livelihood at the moment that his idealism is shooting up. Because I was interested in how sort of, if you think about like a boom and a bust, it sort of makes the same shape as idealism and disillusionment, right? And so I wanted to put those two together.
And the bust actually helped propel his dream.
Yeah.
Made it possible for him to get this land from the ranchers.
Yes, he got cheap land
who went broke.
Yeah. From ranchers who went broke and were really suffering. And they come back in this story, of course, and they're pretty mad.
So you didn't choose this just because of the 80s and being the Reagan era per se.
Right. I mean, it all kind of fit together. Like, I knew I wanted to end the book with the protests against the Gulf War starting. I wanted to end it with the night that the Gulf War started. And that was sort of in my head from the beginning. And I knew I wanted to start it, at least chronologically, not the way the book sort of goes, with this bust, this oil shale bust. I mean, they're both about oil and how that changes America, too.
Did you stop and think, well, writing this about how the Reagan era changed America and what it did to idealism?
I did, of course. Yeah.
So what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I was writing about a part of America in the Reagan years that were those of us who were protesting Reagan at the time. So one of my early memories is of the night Reagan won and how devastated my parents were. And so this sense of a president that we were going to march against, but also was going to be a lot more powerful than us, right? Of course, as presidents are. And so that was an experience of watching sort of my parents through that time and their growing disillusionment was something that I wanted to get at, what it meant to be a child of that. Yeah.
Now, like you, your heroine, Rebecca, grew up in Santa Monica.
Yeah.
So is it wrong to assume that she shares a lot of your youthful experiences or vice versa?
I mean, there's definite crossover. I never went to, my parents are not journalists. So there's that.
Right.
But when you write a novel, of course, you're always looking, there's the emotional truth, and then there's all the stuff that that a character needs to touch and sort of the things that make a book real. And so in reaching for her things, yes, I reached for my things. So like the Christmas tree that was covered with political buttons, where the button on the top said, "Wearing buttons is not enough," instead of the star. Yeah, that was our Christmas tree. So those things were really sort of fun to put in. And her emotional truth, which is a lot about her and her father, is different from mine. But her sense of desire for idealism to be sort of this kind of black and white experience was true of my early years.
Did you make her more naive than you?
Yeah, I did make her more naive.
I mean, she does come across a little naive for a girl from Santa Monica and Berkeley.
Yes,
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think of her as someone who has sheltered herself by so focusing on her parents and her parents' world, which is a sort of fascinating world where people were coming in and out of, but she then kept herself separate from other things that were happening.
She's only one of several wonderful characters, I think, in the book. I'm curious how they developed and what they mean to you. So let's just run down a couple of them, okay? Now, David is Rebecca's somewhat surprising soulmate, I would say, because he basically is her opposite.
Yeah.
He's afraid of the world. He doesn't want, he loves Lamalo because, as he says, it's worlds away from the real world.
Yeah.
At one point he says, the world is a mess and the only thing to do is to get away. So he loves it at this camp,
Yeah.
right? Because he's hiding from the real world, as it were. But he's desperate to believe in something, especially a father figure, which is, and he's drawn to Caleb.
Yeah.
So how did you come up with him?
I knew that I wanted Rebecca to have a friend in her early childhood where they're together and then they separate and they go in very different directions. So she continues, so his parents are work with her parents and are very similar to her parents and are lifelong friends. And they're friends when they're young, and you see them playing games together when they're young and sort of being very similar to their parents. And then he decides that everything their parents believe is not going to come true. And so what's the point? And he becomes sort of a follower of Caleb. And so I wanted this experience. I don't know, I think it happens quite often when you have a friend in an early age and then you diverge so much. And I wanted to see what it was like for them when they come back together.
And she at least is very surprised at that.
Yeah, and she's very surprised to see him at camp because at home he really is kind of a loser and a loner, and you don't get a sense that he has much going on. And at camp he's sort of like, and this was true of kids I knew at camp where they kind of recreated themselves. And so he gets to be sort of the king of Lamalo. You know, everyone loves him, and the girls love him, and she sees this, and I think that's an experience that can happen at camp.
Well, he's the prince because
Yes, Caleb is the king. Yes.
And I found him to be the most complex character. He's a seducer in all meanings of the word, yet he's sincerely passionate about his mission for the camp, which is to change middle-class attitudes about nature and ultimately life. Just came up with him out of the blue or out of the thin air or what?
Well, when I was out of college, I did a lot of work for nonprofits. And so I worked for a bunch of sort of environmental groups and housing projects, and I worked for a lot of camps, and there were always a man in charge. And he was always politically he was doing everything right. And he was charismatic and everyone wanted to please him. But there was so much energy, I realized, spent trying to please him. And he often messed up in a lot of other ways, personal ways. I'm saying there was like 20 of them. And it was like one after the other after the other. And I was interested in creating this morally ambiguous character.
Okay.
Where Caleb, I do believe, is doing something of profundity. And yet at the same time, he is using and abusing his power to do it. Mm-hmm. And to me, that was something I saw over and over again. And I feel like it's an interesting time. When the book came out was a time where I feel like people on the left were didn't want to look at themselves, because it was a time where people were sort of looking at the national stage saying, those people are bad and we are good. Right. And I had sort of written this book saying there's people who have acted poorly in all arenas. Right. Yeah.
Now, his foil is a guy named Donnie,
mm-hmm.
the son of the rancher he bought the land from.
Yeah.
And he's angry. He's a redneck.
Mm-hmm.
He's extremely angry over the loss of his family's ranch and their financial woes, and he blames Caleb.
Mm-hmm.
That's the plot line that adds the tension to the story.
Yeah.
Really drives it
mm-hmm.
forward. Was that really just a plot necessity to have someone like that, or did you feel that that's really part of the scene out there?
Yeah, I mean, when I lived in Colorado, I spent a lot of time with ranchers and miners who were out of work. That's something I covered, and that's my neighbors. And I spent a lot of time covering what was then called the Wise Use Movement. It was following
mm-hmm.
the Sagebrush Rebellion. And I think you could see the seeds of some of our current political divisions in those movements. And so I got to know a lot of miners and ranchers as people, as friends. And I was interested in the dynamic of, there was a huge sort of cultural divide between me and these people I got to know. There was a class divide, even though at the time I wasn't making money, but there was a class divide, and I was urban, they were rural, and yet we were coming together, and we were coming together over sort of a mutual love of the landscape and an interest in the landscape. And I was really wanting, from the start, the book started very differently, as books do, and the book started with Caleb and Donnie's friendship, and then the dismantling of it.
I see.
So I was interested in that from the beginning. Yeah.
Well, let's jump ahead.
mm-hmm.
That land fight seems to be never ending out there.
Mm-hmm.
What's the status of it now? What do you think's happening out there?
Well, I do think that. So when I lived there, it was sort of right when the internet was just starting, and you couldn't live in these tiny towns unless you had a job doing something in those towns. And of course, all that's changed, and people can live anywhere. And I think that has changed Colorado, because people who are going to be novelists, are going to be newspaper reporters, are going to do all sorts of podcasters can live there, and it's changed the culture clash, and it's changed the culture of those towns. But that doesn't change the fact that most of the land in the West is public land,
right.
and the fights over that land continue on the national scale and the local scale.
Right.
Yeah.
I found it interesting that the driving force behind all the main characters seemed to be their relationships with their fathers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Caleb's father committed suicide when he was 13.
Mm-hmm.
David's father divorced his mother and
mm-hmm.
left the family. And Rebecca, of course, just idolizes and it belatedly becomes disappointed. First is confused by and then disappointed by her father.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost seems as if you're warning the readers that we must be prepared to be disappointed by our fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Is that part of the point?
That's interesting. I mean, it was not until sort of the very late draft where I realized, oh, this is a dad book. Like, it took me a while to kind of realize that. And then there's Donnie and his father, Don,
sure,
is in it.
Sure.
And Don does not disappoint Donnie. I mean, he does, but not in the same sort of profound way.
Mm-hmm.
But I did realize later that it's sort of, I think people do often get drawn together almost subconsciously by having to play out similar experiences. And so I think that's part of what bring Caleb and David and Rebecca together, is that they're all sort of playing out this pain that they've experienced. And Rebecca doesn't think she
unknown
is.
to each other.
Unknown to each other, and somewhat unknown to themselves.
Sure.
I don't think either of them are really looking at it that directly. The reader gets to look at it in ways that the characters aren't always doing themselves.
Right, right. I mentioned that the book can be read different ways, and you had a review in the New York Times that made a point that didn't occur to me, perhaps because I'm not Jewish, but this reviewer saw this almost as a metaphor for the Israel and Palestinian situation. Of course, you do have, biblical names for the main characters: Caleb, Rebecca, David. Lamalo is kind of a promised land, at least to some people.
Yeah.
But how did you feel about that review? Was that something in the back of your mind when you wrote it?
Yeah, so I don't think it's not that you're Jewish. So my husband and dear friends, all of who are also Jewish, and my husband read this book, I don't know, like 1,000 times, and then read the review and was like, that's not what I saw. So no, this was kind of across the board. People were surprised. I'll start up by saying I was incredibly grateful to get that review in the New York Times. It's always a thrill. It was a lovely review. Books operate on so many levels. So on the level of plot and character, this to me was very much a book about the West, about the American West, about land. Lamalo has its own history, right? So it was Ute land, then it was homestead land given to Don and Donnie. In that way, Don and Donnie can't be considered parallel to Palestinians because they were sort of given this land by the Americans. They lost the land in through Exxon. It doesn't really line up in that way of plot and character.
Her analogy skips a step.
Yeah. That said, of course, like books also, like they swim in the ocean of metaphor, and I was working with the metaphor of promised land. I wasn't working with the metaphor of Israel as the state we know and understand and think about and ponder. I was working with the sort of Jewish idea of promised land, the Jewish idea of mitzvot, and so to me that was sort of a metaphor about how we feel about land, Jews and not Jews, and how we have created and changed the West.
So much more universal approach to that
than the actual political state.
That narrow political situation. Okay.
Yeah.
One technique I want to ask you about is that the main events take place in 1990, and you fill in backstories going back almost 15 years.
Yeah.
But you do it in reverse chronology. The backstories basically start in the end of 82, and you work your way back towards, I think, 77. How did you come up with that reverse chronology approach?
Sure. So basically it involves a very long hallway in my house.
Really?
What happens is, when I wrote the book, I had a draft where everything that happened in 82 and 83 was book one. And it was what you read first. And then you jump ahead to 1990. And I sent this out to...
Much more traditional.
Much more traditional. I sent this out to a bunch of agents, or maybe I already had an agent at the time. Something happened. Editors read it and said, slow beginning. The action really starts later. And I thought, of course, like the book really is about this summer and these characters later in their lives. So I realized I had to kind of lop off these pages of which I loved, and that's and move them. And I wanted to maintain some of the flashbacks. And so I put all my chapters, I printed them out, I put them in this hallway, and then I tried to weave in some of the backstory, how it went. And so I first did it in normal chronological order, and I realized there was a slowness to that because you were building up, and yet you knew that Caleb got the land. That didn't need to be a mystery. But how he ended up getting it, who he talked to, was actually more interesting if I withheld that. And sort of what he said. So it was really me picking up pages and moving them and kind of standing back and over a couple of days, and that's how I figured that out.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Very tactile.
It's good I have a hallway.
In the essay about your grandmother, you say it took 15 years for you to complete The Optimistic Decade.
Yeah.
I guess it's a new version of "And Still She Persisted."
Yeah.
What sustained you and drove you all that time?
Well, of course, there was a lot of time I wasn't working on it. So I was having children and raising little kids, and I put it away, and I was doing work for money, and I put it away. I remained really interested in the characters, and I remained interested in this, in the West and in Colorado, and I missed that place, and I wanted to see how the characters were going to work things out together and with the land. And I just, so I would put the book away, and I would have to do things for money or with my kids, or, they get sick and then it's a year later sometimes with little kids. And I would think, well, I could start a new novel, and then they would sort of pull me back. And I got a lot of early interest from agents and other people, so I thought, maybe, there's something here, and I kept at it for a long time.
you were busy, so when you finally did write, how did you manage your time?
Really, you know, when the kids were at school, I
Yeah.
would write, just like any minute they were sleeping or at school.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Okay. Now, you mentioned a couple times you were a journalist.
Yeah.
I was a journalist, so I'm like a little curious. How, if at all, did that affect your development of this novel and your actual writing of it?
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think sometimes I think of novels as either you start as a poet or as a journalist and get to it in different ways. And I think coming as a journalist, and before, you know, in college I studied sociology, and I thought I would go on to be a sociologist. I think in terms of sort of a big canvas, less about sentence, which I get to, but that's later in drafts. I like to think about sort of how a town changes, gentrification, land use, and those things are great. I love thinking about them, but of course a novel is a story.
Right.
And you got to get to the people in the story. And I think sometimes coming as a journalist hinders you a little bit because you're thinking about like a big landscape and you got to get smaller.
Okay. Although journalists, we always refer to articles as stories.
Yeah, and they are, and I do like to think of it. Yeah.
Well, we only have a little bit of time left. Are you working on anything now?
I
Have a new book in the works?
I am working on a new novel.
Okay.
I can't say much about it, but it does take place in Massachusetts.
Oh.
So that's exciting for me to kind of dig into some history and learn about the flora and fauna in a new way and really be where I am. I think this book was a way to sort of still be in Colorado while I was living here, and now I get to really live here.
Okay. Well, thanks for coming to the Cape. Like I said, I think this is a great read. I think people will get a lot of different things out of the book and yet still enjoy a great story. I should note that next week, the Optimistic Decade is going to come out in a paperback version. And how would people find that?
I guess in your independent bookstore, because it's
Okay.
independent bookstore day tomorrow, and of course libraries and the internet. Yeah.
Heather Abel, thank you very much. Good luck with it.
It was such a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Books in the World.